Hello everyone. In light of... Why is this always so loud? There we go. In light of my kind of pre-look at, Anima the Reign of Darkness, I decided what I might do, since that was very well received. People seem to like my analysis, type things. I wanted to actually do kind of a retrospective review of Wise 1 and 2, in case you didn't watch the walkthrough and maybe you're thinking about playing the game for yourself, because I totally understand that maybe some people would prefer to play it rather than watch it. So I'm going to let this run. This is the intro sequence to the first one. I don't really intend on showing too much in the way of gameplay, because the gameplay of this game is abnormally straightforward. You run around, you touch an enemy, they take damage, you might take damage if they're looking at you. They might not take damage if they're looking at you, it really depends. But basically it's called a bump system, but I will give an example of this. Or if you want an example of this, and I don't get around to showing an example of the bump system, actually, we might go ahead and skip. I can't skip this. Interesting. Huh. Anyways, if I do get around to it, this particular review, I will show you what the bump system basically looks like. But if I can't get around to that because it's going to take too long for me to get there, just look at the first episode of my playthrough. It's the beginning of the game. There's not really going to be any spoilers there, and I do die to some enemies there. But I wanted to actually retrospectively review the two games, and I'm reviewing both of them at the same time because, as I discussed during the playthrough of the second one, Wise 1 and 2 were actually originally intended to be one game, but due to time constraints, the developers had to split them into two separate games. So I am treating them as one game here, even though technically they're two. So, with that being said, this is a really fantastic short pair of games. It took me a little while longer because I was going a little slower so I could talk about things, and I was getting used to the system and everything. I had done no research on the series really beforehand, other than a vague knowledge of it based on, frankly, my mother playing it several years ago. And not even this one specifically. It might have been this one specifically. I can't remember which one she played. She played one of them on the PlayStation Portable years ago. Regardless, that was about my only interaction with this series overall. So, if I had done some of my normal preparation, my normal research into a game before starting it, I probably could have beaten this in 3 hours, I would say. The second one takes a little bit longer. That's, I would say, 4 or 5 hours, possibly, depending on how fast you go through it. There's more conversation, there's more plot going on in the second one. Or the second half of the game, if you would want to describe it that way, if you are going to go with the combined game idea. But the second one definitely has more going on there. So there is that to consider. Like, they're very short. You could probably, if you had a walkthrough up on your phone ready to go in case you got stuck, I'll talk about that in a bit. But if you had a walkthrough up on your, on your phone, you just turned your phone off and you turned it on only so that way you could access the walkthrough when you got stuck, you could very definitely beat both games within a weekend very easily, assuming you work a classic 5-day work week. That really wouldn't be too difficult for you. Great little pair of games. The bump system is a very simple system, and I absolutely could see that being boring if you played it too much. Fortunately, because the first game is so incredibly short, and the second game isn't a whole lot longer, and these are the only games I've personally seen that has such a system, it's really not that big of a concern that you'll get tired of the system. It's such a unique system compared to what we have nowadays that it's very easy. And the second game does mix it up with magic, which is really nice. So you do have that edition as well. Do I get to show you the bump? Okay, I do get to show you the bump system. Okay, I don't know if I actually have any equipment here. No, I'm just going to go ahead and die then for you. How do I get out of here? There we go. We're just going to go ahead and save. I have a bunch of stuff here, obviously. Previous. So what you do is you basically just bump into him. And as long as he's not facing you directly, you get to do damage. Now, I died here because I don't have any equipment. That's fine. But I also want you to be aware that the bump system is much more finicky and precise in the first game. It's much, much more forgiving in the second game. So the first game actually has this really interesting difficulty spike here of you getting your first level up, really. Your first level or two is incredibly difficult because you're basically a wet noodle. Even when you have, like, the starting out sword and everything, you're incredibly weak. And it takes a bit of trial and error to get to your first level up. But once you hit that first level up, you really snowball quickly. Now, the level cap for the first game is level 10. That's not really spoilery. The second one is level 50. I actually think it's higher than 50, but I don't remember. I don't actually know off the top of my head where it is. I hit level 50-something. I don't know what the actual cap is. But that goes to indicate the kind of difference in length here going on. But excellent little pair of games. If you're trying to introduce somebody to RPGs, this is the series I would start them off with, these two games. Bump system is super easy to understand. The second one incorporates very easy to understand magic. It is a little bit better with controller. You're probably hearing my keyboard in the background when I've been moving around and stuff. But the second one, even though it retains the bump system, the magic inclusion does mix things up enough where it refreshes the formula quite nicely. And the plot is pretty standard. There are a couple of twists and turns that I'm not really going to talk about heavily, but I would say there are two in as you play through the first two, there are definitely a couple of twists that are, one of which I saw coming, another which surprised me somewhat. And there's when you play these two, and if you choose to play other games in the series, I'm discovering that retroactively that there's more to this plot than meets the ear. Again, I'm going to leave that be in case you do want to play through the series yourself. But this is definitely, these two games are definitely where I would start somebody off on RPGs. They're very quick to beat. This first game is a great introduction to the concept of difficulty spikes. It's a pretty easy difficulty spike to overcome because it's simply trial and error. You do just what I did. You save in the village here once you get your sword and your armor, your basic sword and armor. You save, you go out, you try and whack something. If you successfully whack something, you come back, heal up, save, rinse and repeat until eventually you either die and reload or you've killed enough things to hit your first level up. One of the two. So it's a nice introduction to difficulty spikes and early game difficulty spikes, which is not really where a lot of people these days expect difficulty spikes. That's pretty unusual, but this is pretty standard form for us old-timers. The people who've been gaming since there wasn't really PC game. Well, there was PC gaming, but it wasn't as popular as console gaming. You know, back in the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo and the Famicom and stuff. I was born right after I was born right as the SNES was released, or roughly around there. I don't quite remember when that was released, but I'm pretty close to that, as old as the SNES. But, yeah, that's, you know, you've got that, you've got the idea of solving puzzles, most of which are pretty understandable and really well constructed. There are two puzzles in this first one that I goofed. One, because I misunderstood the clue. The second one, I don't know how anybody could have figured that out, and that's somewhere I outright used a walkthrough for. The first one I should have figured out by myself, but I couldn't figure it out because I misunderstood and used a walkthrough for that. So there was 2 points in this game I used a walkthrough, only one of which was my fault. The other one was, I don't know how you're supposed to figure that out. The second one had about the same The same amount of times that I used a walkthrough. For pretty similar reasons, although the second one had slightly easier to understand puzzles. One serious criticism I will level at both of these games is that both of the final bosses of these games are what I call artificial difficulty, or artificially difficult. The difficulty of the final bosses does not come from challenging the skills you've developed over the course of the game. They have a whole bunch of cheap shots and cheap tricks that they use to whack you. So that is a bit frustrating when you're, developing these skills throughout the game, and then at the end, it doesn't really come down to what you've developed. So that is a bit of a downside from my perspective on these two games. But other than that and some mildly eyebrow-raising puzzle presentation, excellent games to start someone off with. This would also be really good for younger children if they want to get into gaming and you're looking for a nice RPG to give them. I know people typically give children Animal Crossing, and that's obviously awesome. I recommend it myself. I've got some cousins who have young children under the age of 10 who play Animal Crossing. But eventually they're going to want to graduate to other games, and this is a game I would recommend to my cousin to present to her children. Hey, this is a great introduction to RPGs. Very simple combat system, pretty straightforward plot that they can practice their reading with, they can understand on their own. For the most part, pretty understandable puzzles. Again, there were a handful of exceptions, but in this day and age, you can also introduce them to the concept of finding information themselves, which is actually a really nice opportunity to teach somebody younger to search up their own information. You could kind of help them search out a walkthrough for this one, and then for the second one, if they really need the help, they can search it up on their own. When you show them where to look and stuff like that. Great learning experience, great bonding experience. Maybe you can play it along, parallel with your child so you can discuss the plot with them. That would also be great as well, again, if you have younger children. But this is really an excellent little pair of games. Again, they're pretty short, so there's very little risk that either you or your child, if you decide to present it to your child, are going to get particularly tired of this. It's a great introduction to a great series. I'm in the middle of, I just recently started Wise Origins. You'll be seeing that video will be released at the same time as today. It was released either right before or right after this video, but I'm playing through that, and that's, a nice evolution from this system, which would, again, if you're curving your child to RPGs, you're trying to introduce them to the RPG genre, the Wise Origins is another excellent, would be a nice step up from that, with a slightly more complicated combat system and a slightly more involved plot related to this one that they can really put into context, and you can introduce them to that kind of thing as well, like linear multi-game plots. So that would be my overall recommendation for these two particular games. I would personally give them... it's kind of tough. I'm going to give them a 9 out of 10. But I could absolutely see somebody else giving them as low as an 8. Now, I'm going to explain my numbers. Now, I'm giving them a 9 out of 10 because the final bosses are gimmicky and cheap. Terribly designed final bosses. And I will concede that a couple of the puzzles are absolute curveballs from out of nowhere. I have no idea how you would be intended to figure these puzzles out back in the day when there wasn't widespread internet usage, because there's zero indication of what you're supposed to do next. This is mildly helped in the second one with a particular item about 3/4 of the way through the game, unfortunately, but it does show up. A partial solution to this does show up in the second game, but you're on your own in this first one. And then, beyond that, those are my only real two criticisms: is the final boss and a couple of the puzzle presentations are terrible. Somebody who maybe hates simple combat systems would definitely not enjoy this series. And I could also see somebody who really loves this game having an issue with the shortness of it. It's both these games are very short in duration, and I could absolutely see that being a drawback. Personally, for me personally, I don't mind a simple combat system as long as it doesn't last too long. So for me, I enjoy the simple combat system. It is a very unique combat system that I personally haven't seen. I know it exists in a couple of other games. I just can't remember any of their titles off the top of my head. But it's a rare enough combat system where I don't see it that often, and having it here really quick in such a brief burst was a really nice, pleasant time. And I think that the games are just about the correct length to not wear out their welcome, especially considering the simplicity of the combat system and the plot. So that's really overall my review of Wise 1 and 2. I will be continuing this quote-unquote series. I'll be reviewing things that you've seen me play, things that you've not seen me play overall, and just generally just a lot of stuff going on in general. Actually, I think I'll bump my... I'm going to decrease my score of this to 8.5, simply because there's not a whole lot of replay value here. I have not come back. I mean, there is to some extent some replay value. You could play it on a harder difficulty. You could try to collect all the trophies, but once you collect all the trophies and you've beaten it at the highest difficulty and you've done the time attack on the main menu, there's really no reason to come back to this. There is no variation. It's the same thing every time. But yeah, there's really not a whole lot of incentive to return to this game once you've beaten it. Even playing on harder difficulties, honestly, there's nothing new added here. It's just the enemies are tougher. That is literally the only difference. And quite frankly, that's not justification enough for me to come back on a harder difficulty a lot of the time. If you change things up, it's totally different. A great example would actually be the Advance Wars series, where after you beat the main campaign, you could play a hard campaign that was totally different. The plot was the same, so you could just skip the cutscenes, but the actual maps and the setups were completely different. That's a great thing. But for Wise here, there's no difference in difficulties. The enemies are just harder, and that just makes the final boss an even greater pain in the neck to deal with. And again, it's just mostly about getting rid of the boss before the boss cheap shots you to death in both games. And that's something that I really don't care for. I don't have the time for. I just don't care. But that is where basically I'm going to leave this. So yeah, that's my impression of Wise 1 and 2. A great little pair of games, nice and short. A really old, simple combat system that doesn't wear out its welcome because the games are short. Pretty straightforward plot. Again, doesn't wear out its welcome because of the short duration of the games. I do have mild concerns with Wise Origins that might possibly be too long for its combat system and simple plot. Assuming the plot of Origins is as simple as this. But I'll have to see. And when I'm done with Wise Origins, you'll be seeing that in a video as well. A review of that as well. But in the meantime, that's about all I'm going to say about this. So, just something I felt like doing. So thank you all very much for joining me. If you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And, yeah, have a great 24 hours.